On the morning of March 7th, 2012, at precisely 8:43, a John Deere sales representative named Brandon Coel pulled his company SUV into the gravel parking lot outside the Greeley County Farmers Cooperative offices in Tribune, Kansas, and climbed out with the particular confidence of a man arriving to complete a transaction he has already mentally completed. The confidence of someone who has done the preliminary work and received the preliminary signals and is now simply showing up to collect the signature that transforms 11 months of relationship building into the largest single equipment sale in Greeley County history. 40 brand new John Deere machines, tractors and combines and specialty equipment totaling $12.4 million. A sale that Brandon had been cultivating since the previous April, and that his regional manager had already entered into the quarterly forecast, and that Brandon had already mentally converted into the commission that was going to allow him to finish the basement of his house in Garden City before his daughter's birthday in June. And Brandon walked through the cooperative's front door at 8:44 with his leather portfolio under his arm and his hand extended toward the receptionist, and his smile carrying the full weight of a man who believes the day ahead of him has only one possible outcome. Calvin Mercer was standing at the window of his office on the building's second floor when Brandon's SUV pulled in, standing with his coffee cup in both hands the way he stood at the window every morning, watching the parking lot and the street beyond it, and the flat Kansas horizon beyond that with the patient attentiveness of a man who has learned that the most important information usually arrives quietly and from unexpected directions. And Calvin watched Brandon climb out of the SUV with his portfolio and his smile, and felt something that he had been feeling for 11 months during every conversation with Brandon about the equipment order, which was the specific discomfort of a man who knows something the person in front of him does not know, and who has not yet decided what to do with that knowledge. And Calvin set his coffee cup on the windowsill and straightened his jacket and went downstairs to meet Brandon in the conference room where the signing was scheduled for 9 o'clock. And when he walked into the conference room and saw the documents laid out on the table with the signature tabs already attached and Brandon standing beside them with his hand extended and his smile fully deployed, Calvin shook Brandon's hand and sat down across from the documents and looked at them for a moment and then looked at Brandon and said, "Brandon, I'm not going to sign these today."
And the conference room was quiet in the way that conference rooms are quiet when something has been said that nobody in the room was prepared for, and Brandon's smile changed in the specific way that smiles change when the assumption underlying them has just been removed, and he said, "Calvin, I don't understand." And Calvin said, "I'm canceling the order, Brandon. The full order. All 40 units. And Brandon sat down slowly in the chair across the table and said, "Calvin, we've been working on this for 11 months. Your board approved the purchase in January. We're scheduled for delivery in June." And Calvin said, "I know." And Brandon said, "Is it a financing issue? Because I can get our finance division on the phone today and we can restructure." And Calvin said, "It's not financing." And Brandon said, "Is it the equipment? Because if there are specific units you want to substitute, I have flexibility on the configuration." And Calvin said, "It's not the equipment." And Brandon said, "Calvin, I need to understand what's happening here. I have 40 units on order. I have a delivery schedule. I have a regional manager who has this in his quarterly numbers. Can you help me understand what changed?" And Calvin looked at Brandon with the expression of a man who has considered how much to say and has arrived at a precise amount, which was enough to be honest and not enough to explain everything, and said, "Brandon, I've decided that the cooperative's equipment needs are better served by a different approach at this time. I'm sorry for the late notice, and I understand this creates difficulty for you, and I'll put that apology in writing if it helps with your regional manager, but the decision is made and it's not going to change." And Brandon looked at the documents on the table and looked at Calvin and said, "A different approach, meaning what?" And Calvin said, "Meaning we'll be retaining and refurbishing our existing fleet for the foreseeable future rather than purchasing new equipment." And Brandon said, "Calvin, your existing fleet is 8 to 12 years old." And Calvin said, "I know how old my fleet is, Brandon." And Brandon said, "The maintenance costs alone on equipment that age will exceed." And Calvin said, "I've run the numbers, Brandon." and the way he said it, quietly and without emphasis and with the complete absence of any invitation for further discussion, communicated something that Brandon had not encountered often in 11 years of equipment sales, which was a man who had genuinely run the numbers and genuinely understood what they said and was genuinely not going to be moved by any version of the argument Brandon was preparing to make. And Brandon picked up his portfolio and stood up and said, "I hope you'll reconsider." And Calvin said, "I won't," and walked Brandon to the door and shook his hand and watched the company SUV back out of the gravel parking lot and turn onto the Tribune Street and disappear in the direction of the highway. And then he went back upstairs to his office and stood at the window with his coffee cup and looked at the flat Kansas horizon and felt not relief exactly and not satisfaction exactly, but the specific settled feeling of a man who has done something difficult that needed to be done and has done it in the right way and at the right time and can now move forward into whatever the decision produces, which he understood better than anyone in Greeley County was going to understand for quite some time. To understand why Calvin Mercer canceled a $12.4 million equipment order on the morning of March 7, 2012, you had to go back to a Tuesday evening in November of 2010, 16 months earlier, when a retired John Deere engineer named Norm Hastings had driven his weathered Ford pickup down the gravel road to the Greeley County Farmers Cooperative offices and asked the receptionist if Calvin Mercer had a few minutes. And the receptionist had called upstairs, and Calvin had come down and found a man he had met once at a county agricultural meeting standing in the lobby with his hat in his hands, and the particular expression of someone who has been carrying something for a while and has finally decided to set it down in front of the right person. And Calvin had said, "Norm." And Norm had said, "Calvin, I need to show you something." And Calvin had taken him upstairs to his office and closed the door, and Norm had sat across the desk and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document and set it on the desk between them and said, "I worked for John Deere's product development division for 27 years before I retired in 2008, and what I'm showing you is a product roadmap that was current when I left. It covers their equipment platform strategy through 2020, and I want you to read it before I say anything else, because I want your reaction to be to the document and not to my description of it." And Calvin had looked at Norm and then at the document and picked it up and read it the way he read everything, carefully and completely and without rushing. And when he finished, he set it down and looked at Norm and said, "Is this accurate?" And Norm said, "It was accurate when I left in 2008, and everything I've seen from John Deere in the 4 years since suggests it remains accurate." And Calvin said, "You're telling me they're moving the entire product line to a closed software architecture." And Norm said, "By 2014 or 2015, every new unit they sell will be running software that can only be diagnosed and serviced through their authorized dealer network. The diagnostic ports will be locked to third-party tools. The repair manuals will be replaced by software interfaces that only authorized technicians can access. And every farmer who buys a new John Deere after the transition will be entirely dependent on the authorized service network for anything beyond basic maintenance." And Calvin said, "And the service cost implications." And Norm said, "Calvin, right now an independent mechanic charges between $65 and $90 an hour for equipment service. The authorized dealer rate in this region is between $145 and $185 an hour. When the software transition locks out independent mechanics entirely, the authorized rate will have no competitive pressure, and I expect it to reach $200 to $250 an hour within 3 years of the transition." And Calvin said, "On equipment that a cooperative this size runs for 12 to 14 hours a day during planting and harvest." And Norm said, "The service cost increase on a 40-unit fleet over a 10-year ownership period will exceed the initial purchase price of the fleet." And the words landed in Calvin's office the way words land when they are both surprising and completely logical. Surprising because nobody had said them before, and completely logical because once they were said, the arithmetic was obvious, and the arithmetic did not require a 27-year career at John Deere's product development division to validate, just a calculator and the honesty to follow the numbers where they led. Calvin asked Norm why he was bringing this to him specifically, and Norm said, "Because you run the largest cooperative in 3 counties, and because I've watched you make decisions for 15 years that were based on what the numbers actually said, rather than what everyone around you wanted them to say, and because I retired to a farm 12 miles outside Tribune, and I intend to keep farming it, and the farmers in this county are my neighbors, and what I'm showing you is going to affect every one of them, and I'd rather it affect them less than it affects the cooperatives in the counties around us."
And Calvin said, "Why didn't you say something when you were still at John Deere?"
And Norm looked at his hat in his hands and said, "Because when you work inside something, it's harder to see it clearly, and because the decisions were above my level, and because I told myself it was a legitimate business strategy." And it is a legitimate business strategy, Calvin. I'm not saying John Deere is doing something illegal. I'm saying they're doing something that will cost farmers significantly more than they currently understand, and that the time to prepare for it is before you've committed $12 million to the equipment generation that will carry the new software architecture, not after. And Calvin had sat with that for a long moment, and then said, "Norm, I need to keep this between us for now." And Norm said, "I expected that." And Calvin said, "I need time to verify what I can verify independently and to run the numbers myself and to make a decision that I can defend to my board without revealing the source of the original concern." And Norm said, "Take whatever time you need." And Calvin said, "I appreciate you coming to me." And Norm said, "I appreciate you listening. A lot of people would have sent me home as a crank." And Calvin said, "I read the document, Norm. Nobody who read that document would send you home as a crank." And Norm had driven back down the gravel road in his weathered Ford pickup, and Calvin had sat in his office until 9 that evening running numbers on a legal pad with the focused intensity of a man who has been handed a problem he cannot unknow and must therefore solve. And what the numbers on the legal pad told him by 9 o'clock was the same thing they would tell him every time he ran them over the following 16 months, which was that the cooperative that committed to John Deere's new equipment generation before the software transition arrived was the cooperative that would spend the following decade paying for that commitment in service costs that the original purchase price had not revealed, and that the authorized dealer network had no incentive to reduce because the closed software architecture would have eliminated every alternative the farmers had previously relied on to keep those costs honest. And Calvin had gone home that night and told his wife Margaret that he was going to make a decision in the next year or two that nobody around him was going to understand, and that she should be prepared for that. And Margaret had said, "Calvin, I've been married to you for 38 years. I'm always prepared for that." And Calvin had laughed for the first time since Norm Hastings had walked into the cooperative's lobby with his hat in his hands and a folded document in his jacket pocket. And the laugh had the quality of a man releasing something he has been holding carefully, the specific relief of a person who has been given a problem large enough to require the best of them and who has accepted the requirement without flinching. The 16 months between Norm Hastings' visit in November of 2010 and the morning of March 7, 2012, were the months in which Calvin Mercer did the verification work that his conversation with Norm had made necessary, because Calvin was not a man who acted on a single source, regardless of how credible that source was or how compelling the document it produced, was instead a man who treated every significant decision as a research project that required multiple independent lines of evidence converging on the same conclusion before the conclusion could be trusted enough to act on. And the research he conducted over those 16 months was methodical and quiet and entirely invisible to everyone around him, including Frank Odell, who managed the cooperative's equipment fleet and who worked alongside Calvin every day, and who would later say that he had noticed Calvin reading more industry publications than usual during that period, and asking more specific questions about John Deere's product development announcements, but had not connected those observations into anything meaningful until March 7, 2012 made the connection unavoidable.
The first independent line of evidence came from the Agricultural Technology Press, specifically from 3 industry publications that Calvin had been reading for 20 years and that between November 2010 and March 2012 published 14 articles touching on John Deere's software strategy, articles that individually said less than Norm's document said, but that collectively described a direction that was entirely consistent with what Norm had shown him, a company moving deliberately and systematically toward a software architecture that would differentiate its product not primarily on mechanical performance,
but on the integration of its digital ecosystem, an ecosystem whose value to the farmer increased with each new unit purchased and whose switching cost increased with each year of operation. And Calvin had read each of those articles and noted the relevant passages and added them to a folder that was growing in his desk drawer, with the steady accumulation of a case being built from evidence rather than argument. The second line came from a conversation Calvin had in March of 2011 with an agricultural economist named Dr. Patricia Holden at Kansas State University, who had been studying equipment ownership costs in large-scale farming operations and who had published a preliminary paper on the cost implications of proprietary service architectures in agricultural equipment that had received almost no attention in the farming community because it was written in academic language for an academic audience and because the implications it described were sufficiently distant from the present moment that most farmers who encountered it filed it under future concern rather than current problem. And Calvin had driven to Manhattan, Kansas, and sat in Dr. Holden's office for 2 hours and asked her questions that she later told a colleague were the most specific and operationally grounded questions any non-academic had ever asked her about her research. And Dr. Holden had told Calvin that her modeling suggested service cost increases of between 180% and 240% on equipment operating under closed software architectures compared to equipment serviceable by independent mechanics. And Calvin had said, over what time horizon? And Dr. Holden had said, 7 to 10 years from the point of software lock implementation. And Calvin had driven back to Tribune and added Dr. Holden's paper to the folder in his desk drawer and sat with the numbers for a long time before moving to the third line of evidence. The third line was the one that required the most patience and the most careful execution, which was a series of conversations with independent equipment mechanics across western Kansas conducted over 8 months between June 2011 and February 2012. Mechanics who serviced John Deere equipment and who had been watching the changes in John Deere's diagnostic and repair documentation with the professional attention of people whose livelihood depended on understanding what those changes meant for their ability to work on the equipment their customers brought them, and what those mechanics told Calvin, independently and without knowledge of each other's conversations with him, was consistent enough to constitute a third convergent line pointing in the same direction as Norm's document and Dr. Holden's research, which was that the diagnostic access available to independent mechanics on John Deere's newest equipment generations was already narrowing, that certain fault codes and certain system resets that had been accessible through standard third-party diagnostic tools 18 months ago were no longer accessible, that the trend was unmistakable to anyone paying attention, and that the mechanics who were paying attention were already beginning to diversify toward equipment brands whose software architecture remained open. And one mechanic named Cleet Dawson outside Dighton had said to Calvin in January of 2012, with the directness of a man who has watched something coming and is tired of being the only one who sees it, Calvin, in 3 years I won't be able to touch a new John Deere, not because I don't know how, but because the software won't let me in. And if I can't touch it, your authorized dealer is the only option you have, and your authorized dealer knows that as well as I do and will price accordingly.
And Calvin had driven home from Dighton with the folder in his passenger seat and 3 independent lines of evidence pointing at the same conclusion, and the conclusion was the same conclusion Norm Hastings' document had suggested 16 months earlier, confirmed and quantified and sourced from people who had no knowledge of each other and no reason to coordinate their assessments. And Calvin had gone home that evening and told Margaret that he had made his decision, and Margaret had said, "The John Deere order?" And Calvin had said, "Yes." And Margaret had said, "The board is going to push back hard." And Calvin had said, "I know." And Margaret had said, "Are you going to show them the document?" And Calvin had said, "Not yet." And Margaret had said, "When?" And Calvin had said, "When the situation makes it necessary, which won't be now, because right now it would just look like one retired engineer's opinion, and what I need the board to trust is my judgment, not Norm's document." And Margaret had looked at her husband across 38 years of marriage and said, "Your judgment has earned that trust, Calvin." And Calvin had said, "I hope the board agrees." And Margaret had said, "Present the numbers, not the source." And Calvin had said, "That's exactly what I intend to do."
The board meeting was on February 28, 2012, and Calvin had presented his analysis over 90 minutes using the industry publications and Dr. Holden's research and the mechanics' assessments and his own cost modeling. And the board had pushed back with the specific resistance of people being asked to abandon a decision they had already made and whose reversal would create complications they had not anticipated. And the longest and most difficult part of the conversation had been with Frank Odell, who said, "Calvin, we've been planning this fleet renewal for 2 years. Our existing equipment is aging out. If we don't replace it now, we're going to be running machines that cost us more in downtime than a new fleet would cost in service." And Calvin had said, "Frank, I've modeled the downtime costs on our existing fleet against the projected service costs on a new fleet under the software architecture that's coming, and the existing fleet is cheaper by a margin that grows every year for the first decade." And Frank had said, "You're projecting service costs that haven't happened yet." And Calvin had said, "I'm projecting service costs based on 3 independent sources and a decade of equipment industry analysis and my own 30 years of running numbers for this cooperative." And Frank had looked at the board, and the board had looked at Calvin, and the room had the quality of a moment balanced on a single person's credibility. And Calvin had let it balance there without adding anything, because he had said what the evidence supported, and the rest was trust, and trust was either present or it wasn't, and adding more words to a trust question never resolved it in the right direction. And the board had approved the cancellation by a vote of 7-2, and Calvin had called Brandon Coel the next morning to schedule the meeting that Brandon would arrive at on March 7th with his leather portfolio and his smile and his mentally completed commission check and his complete absence of preparation for what Calvin was going to say. The 18 months following the cancellation were the most uncomfortable 18 months of Calvin Mercer's professional life, not because the decision was wrong, but because the decision was not yet visibly right, and the distance between a decision that is correct and a decision that is visibly correct is where a man's relationship with his own judgment is most severely tested, and Calvin's judgment was tested daily by the specific and sustained pressure of a farming community that had watched him cancel the largest equipment order in Greeley County history and replace it with a refurbishment program for aging machines, and that had formed a collective opinion of that decision which was not favorable and was not quiet, and was delivered to Calvin in the various direct and indirect ways that small agricultural communities deliver their collective opinions to the people who have deviated from the consensus, at the feed store and the farm bureau meetings and the county fair and the First Methodist Church in Tribune, where Calvin and Margaret attended services every Sunday, and where the conversations after the service had a quality during that 18-month period that Margaret described to her sister as exhausting in the specific way that being right too early is always exhausting. Doug Sellers was the most vocal, and Doug's vocality was understandable because Doug was the manager of the Western Kansas Tri-County Cooperative 60 miles north of Tribune, and because Doug had signed a $14.8 million John Deere fleet order in April of 2012, 6 weeks after Calvin's cancellation, and had done so with the full confidence of a man who had watched his regional competitor walk away from the same decision and had concluded that walking away was either an error or a symptom of institutional timidity that the Tri-County Cooperative did not share. And Doug had said at the Kansas Cooperative Managers Association meeting in Wichita in September of 2012, in a room that included Calvin, that the Greeley County Cooperative's decision to forego fleet renewal in favor of maintaining aging equipment represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between capital investment and operational efficiency. And the room had received this observation with the nodding attention that rooms give to statements that confirm what the room already believes, and Calvin had sat in his chair and said nothing, because the moment did not require a response, and because the response that the moment would eventually provide would be more complete and more durable than anything Calvin could have said in a Wichita conference room in September of 2012. Frank Odell came to Calvin's office in the summer of 2013 and sat across the desk with the expression of a man who has been carrying a question for a year and has finally decided to ask it directly, and said, Calvin, the Henderson unit needs a new hydraulic pump. That's $4,200, and a Callaway combine is showing early bearing wear that's going to be a significant repair in the next season. And our total refurbishment expenditure this year is going to exceed what we budgeted by about $60,000, and I need to understand whether we're still on the right side of your numbers. And Calvin opened his desk drawer and produced the cost modeling spreadsheet he had built in November 2010 and updated every quarter since, and set it in front of Frank and said, "Find the column labeled Year 2 Refurbishment Variance." And Frank found it and looked at the number and said, "You projected a $55,000 to $65,000 variance in Year 2. And Calvin said, "What's our actual variance?" And Frank said, $60,000. And Calvin said, "We're inside the model, Frank."
And Frank looked at the spreadsheet and then at Calvin and said, "You modeled this in 2010. And Calvin said, "November 2010. And Frank said, "How?" And Calvin said, "I had good information about where the industry was going and I built the model around that information." And Frank said, "What information?" And Calvin said, "I'll show you when the time is right." And Frank looked at the spreadsheet again and said, "Calvin, are we going to be okay?" And Calvin said, "Frank, look at column 8, year 7, net position." And Frank found column 8 and looked at the number and was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's a $2.1 million favorable variance against a new fleet purchase." And Calvin said, "Assuming the service cost trajectory I modeled, yes." And Frank said, "And if the trajectory is wrong?" And Calvin said, "It's not wrong." And Frank said, "You're certain?" And Calvin said, "I'm as certain as the evidence allows, and the evidence is strong." And Frank nodded and stood up and then stopped at the door and said, "The 2 board members who voted against the cancellation are still asking questions at meetings." And Calvin said, "I know." And Frank said, "What do I tell them?" And Calvin said, "Tell them to look at column 8. And Frank almost smiled and went back to the equipment yard, and Calvin went back to the quarterly update of the cost modeling spreadsheet that he had been maintaining since November 2010, with the patient discipline of a man who understands that a decision's vindication arrives on its own schedule, and that the only thing required of the person who made the decision is to remain in a position to receive the vindication when it comes, which meant keeping the cooperative's operations solvent and its equipment functional and its cost structure inside the model's predictions through every uncomfortable month of the 18 that followed the cancellation, and through every conversation at the feed store, and every observation at the Farm Bureau meeting, and every post-church exchange in Tribune's First Methodist parking lot where someone who had heard about the canceled order felt entitled to an explanation that Calvin consistently declined to provide because the explanation would arrive when the evidence arrived, and the evidence had not yet arrived, but was moving toward Tribune, Kansas on the schedule that John Deere's product development division had set in motion years before Norm Hastings had driven his weathered Ford pickup truck down the gravel road to the cooperative offices with a folded document in his jacket pocket and the quiet determination of a man who has decided that the right person needs to see what he has been carrying. The software transition arrived in April of 2015, not dramatically and not with any announcement directed at the farming community, but quietly and institutionally the way large corporate strategy shifts arrive, embedded in the updated service documentation and the revised dealer training programs and the new diagnostic tool requirements that John Deere's authorized dealer network received in a series of communications beginning in early 2015 that collectively described a service architecture so fundamentally different from what had preceded it that the independent mechanics who had been servicing John Deere equipment for decades recognized its implications immediately, and the farmers who owned the equipment recognized them approximately 6 months later when the first major service events occurred under the new architecture, and the invoices arrived with numbers that did not resemble any previous service invoice in the farmer's experience, and the recognition that spread through western Kansas farming communities in the fall of 2015 and through the winter that followed had the specific quality of understanding that arrives too late to change the decision that made the understanding necessary, the recognition of people who have signed a contract and are now reading it carefully for the first time because the terms have begun to apply. Doug Sellers called Calvin on a Wednesday morning in March of 2016, and the call came in at 7:15, which told Calvin before Doug said a single word that the call was not a casual one, because Doug Sellers did not call at 7:15 in the morning for casual conversations. And Doug said, "Calvin, I need to talk to you." And Calvin said,
"Good morning, Doug." And Doug said, "My authorized service costs for the last 2 quarters are running at $247 per hour for diagnostic work and $218 per hour for scheduled maintenance." And Calvin said, "I heard the rates had moved." And Doug said, "Moved is not the word I would use, Calvin. 18 months ago, I was paying $145 for diagnostic work. I'm now paying $247. That's a 70% increase in 18 months on a fleet of 42 units that each require between 180 and 240 service hours annually." And Calvin said, "What does that do to your operating margin?" And Doug said, "It eliminates it, Calvin. I'm running a cooperative with $14.8 million in equipment debt and service costs that have increased by $340,000 annually in 18 months, and I have no alternative because the software architecture on every unit in my fleet locks out every independent mechanic in the region, and my authorized dealer knows that as well as I do." And Calvin said, "I'm sorry, Doug." And Doug said, "Are you?" And Calvin said, "Yes, genuinely." And Doug said, "You knew, didn't you?" And Calvin was quiet for a moment and then said, "I had strong evidence that this was coming, yes." And Doug said, "In 2012. And Calvin said, "In 2010. And Doug said, "4 years before it happened." And Calvin said, "Yes." And Doug said, "And you canceled the order." And Calvin said, "Yes." And Doug said, "And you said nothing to the rest of us." And Calvin said, "Doug, I presented my analysis to my board in February of 2012, and I was prepared to share it with anyone who asked me directly why I had canceled." And Doug said, "Nobody asked you directly." And Calvin said, "No." And Doug said, "Because everyone assumed you'd made a mistake." And Calvin said, "Yes." And Doug said, "I stood up in Wichita in September of 2012 and said your decision represented a fundamental misunderstanding of capital investment and operational efficiency." And Calvin said, "I remember." And Doug said, "And you sat there and said nothing." And Calvin said, "The evidence wasn't visible yet, Doug. Anything I said in September of 2012 would have been my word against the industry consensus, and the industry consensus was on your side of the room." And Doug was quiet for a long moment and then said, "What do I do now?" And Calvin said, "What does your fleet replacement timeline look like?" And Doug said, "I'm locked into this equipment for at least 6 more years on the debt structure." And Calvin said, "Then the question is how you manage service costs within the authorized network for 6 years." And Doug said, "How do you manage something that has no competition and no ceiling?" And Calvin said, "You organize." And Doug said, "What do you mean?" And Calvin said, "You find every cooperative and every large operation in your region that is in the same position, and you form a collective service negotiation group, and you approach John Deere's regional service management as a single entity representing a volume of service business large enough that they have an economic incentive to negotiate. They won't move to independent pricing, but they'll move from 247 if the alternative is losing the consolidated service contracts of a dozen large cooperatives simultaneously." And Doug said, "Will that work?" And Calvin said, "It worked for purchasing. There's no reason it won't work for service if the volume is sufficient." And Doug said, "Will you help us?" And Calvin said, "Yes." And Doug said, "Why?" And Calvin said, "Because you're my neighbor, Doug. The same reason anyone helps anyone out here." And Doug was quiet again and then said, "I owe you an apology, Calvin." The Wichita comment. And Calvin said, "Forget it." And Doug said, "I don't think I can forget it." And Calvin said, "Then remember it as the thing that makes you better at the next decision and let go of the rest," which is what Calvin himself had been doing with every uncomfortable month since March of 2012, and which was the only productive use of a mistake that had already been made and could not be unmade. The document came out of Calvin's desk drawer for the first time in 6 years on a Thursday evening in September of 2016 at a meeting Calvin had organized at the cooperative offices in Tribune that was attended by 14 cooperative managers from across western Kansas, including Doug Sellers and Frank Odell and Norm Hastings himself, who drove his weathered Ford pickup down the gravel road one more time and sat in the back of the room with his hat in his hands and watched Calvin lay the product roadmap on the conference table and explain to 14 men what it said, and when he had obtained it, and what he had done with it, and why he had kept it private until the moment when its contents were visible in the actual experience of every person in the room. And the room was very quiet while Calvin talked, the specific quiet of people receiving an explanation that answers questions they have been carrying for 4 years. And when Calvin finished, Frank Odell said, "You had this in November 2010. And Calvin said, "Norm brought it to me." and 14 heads turned toward the back of the room where Norm Hastings sat with his hat in his hands, and Norm said, "I worked there for 27 years. I knew what was coming. I brought it to the right man." And Doug Sellers looked at the document and looked at Calvin and said, "You built a model in 2010 that predicted our service costs in 2015. And Calvin said, "Within 8%. And Doug said, "And you canceled a $12 million order based on that model." And Calvin said, "Yes." And Doug said, "And you kept the document private until tonight." And Calvin said, "Until tonight, the document would have been a retired engineer's opinion. Tonight, it is the explanation for something everyone in this room has already lived through." And Doug looked at the document, and then at the 14 managers around the table, and then at Norm in the back of the room and said, "What do we do now?" And Calvin said, "Now we organize." And the meeting that followed lasted 3 hours and produced the Western Kansas Cooperative Service Alliance, a collective negotiating body representing 16 cooperatives and $180 million in annual John Deere service expenditure. And the first negotiating session with John Deere's regional service management in December of 2016 produced a 22% reduction in authorized service rates for alliance members. Not independence, not the open architecture that Cleet Dawson outside Dighton had been mourning since 2015, but a meaningful reduction in the cost that the closed architecture imposed. Meaningful enough to restore operating margins that had been eliminated and to demonstrate that the farmers on the receiving end of a corporate strategy they had not anticipated were still capable of organizing an effective response when the right person had spent 6 years preparing the ground for exactly that response. And Calvin drove home from the December meeting on the flat Kansas highway in the dark and thought about Norm Hastings driving his Ford pickup down the gravel road in November of 2010 with a folded document in his jacket pocket, and thought about Walt Gideon telling Harold Briggs on the steps of a bank in Sedalia that, "You don't repay me, you do for the next man what I did for you," and thought about all the quiet preparations and the patient waitings and the decisions made in private that only become visible when the world finally catches up to what one careful man already understood, and felt the specific satisfaction of a person whose longest-held conviction has been confirmed not by argument but by reality, which is the only confirmation that lasts.